Hey everybody, welcome back to #Fempire. Today's guest is a powerhouse in the nonprofit world, shaking things up with bold ideas, lived experience, and a strategic vision for change. Maria Rio is the founder of Further Together, a fundraising consulting firm she launched in 2023. But her story doesn't start there. Maria came to Canada as a refugee, and her early experiences with charitable services sparked a lifelong commitment to equity, community, and transformative nonprofit work. From her first days as a face-to-face fundraiser back in 2011 to leading development and communications at small and mid-sized nonprofits, Maria has seen it all, and she's not afraid to challenge the status quo. She's also a fierce spokesperson for the fundraising sector. From appearances on TVO's The Agenda and City News, to speaking at conferences like Imagine Canada, and even addressing the Ontario legislature. Her work has been published in the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, and she was even a finalist for the Charity Village Best Individual Fundraiser Award in 2022. Maria's voice is bold and unapologetically rooted in community. She's a leading advocate for community-centric fundraising, an entrepreneur selected for the L Accelerator at York University, and co-host of the Small Nonprofit podcast. In this episode, we're diving into Maria's journey, what it means to build equity-driven fundraising models, and how the nonprofit world can move beyond outdated playbooks towards action rooted in knowledge, insight, justice, and equity, not ignorance. So, let's get into it. Maria, thanks so much for joining us.
Yay, so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I've been focusing a lot on the nonprofit sector recently and had the pleasure of meeting with some of your colleagues, including Esther Lee. So I want to start off. What sparked the idea behind Further Together, and what made you finally say, I'm going to build this company?
Yeah, I came to Canada as a refugee when I was 9 years old, and I had lived in a World Vision refugee shelter with my mom and my sibling for about 6 months. So my mom came as a single mom, and just like a lot of things were difficult. Accessing food banks, drop-ins, getting gifts from strangers were not abnormal for our family at that time. And when I was old enough to start fundraising, I bumped into those face-to-face fundraisers on the street representing World Vision for a company called Public Outreach. So I was like, oh, hey, I would love to do that because how impactful would it be to actually be the person who benefited from these services soliciting the donation? So I thought, wow, amazing. And that's how I started fundraising. But because of my lived experience, like once I got into nonprofit proper, I was a little bit upset with how little we're doing as a sector to actually move social justice values forward, to do public policy advocacy, to even say the quiet part out loud with a statement. Like there's just a lot of resistance to working in community and to being bold, being innovative in a sector that is obviously not solving systemic issues. Like we've been trying to do things piecemeal for a long time and it's just not working. So at the time, I had become extremely frustrated with my board because they just kept nagging me about doing a gala. And it's like, hey, I've already replaced the revenue from the gala that we lost during COVID. I've increased our revenue by $1 million, and you're still talking about a gala. So it's not about the revenue, it's about the actual event. But the event by design was exclusionary of our service users at a food bank. So it wasn't something that I was loving, and it wasn't the first time that I had those conversations of like, can we do things better? No, on World Hijab Day, we should not all put on hijabs. So there's just like a lot of scenarios that made me unhappy being an in-house fundraiser. So I thought maybe going off alone would be a good opportunity to live in a way more authentic to my values, in a way where I'm not concerned about the leaders that I'm propping up and who are using like my reputation as an advocate to kind of like wash their own brand. And in a way that also allows for other people to join me in my business as kind of like refugees from the nonprofit sector. So coming to a place where they also feel like they can live with their values.
Wow, that was a really powerful story, Maria. Then thank you so much for sharing. When you say you were being used as kind of an advocate maybe sometimes for their cause? Like, did you feel it very explicitly, or was it more of like a hidden kind of way to prop you up to get more money out of maybe donors? Like, I'm just curious around that, if you're comfortable sharing.
I think it's happened like multiple times at two different organizations. So in one, we did a lot of advocacy work. So I would bring in my knowledge around social justice, advocacy, being a racialized person, X, Y, and Z to inform our communications and our fundraising work as a person leading the strategy. But then when something was deemed as too political, like instead of naming it, even though they had benefited from all the social justice communications and fundraising before, sometimes they would get prickly about those kind of things. So like they're okay taking gifts that are a couple $100,000 while not knowing what BIPOC stood for. Things like that. It's like you're benefiting off of my knowledge, but you're not the right leader to lead the work.
Wow. Um, it's interesting, and I really like, my mind keeps getting blown the more and more I have these conversations about what happens in the nonprofit sector. And Liz LeClaire, my most recent guest, was talking about the waspiness around the culture. And the way that you're describing it as well is, well, we have to be careful when we're saying certain things with certain people. And this might be a bit of a big question, but why is it that we have to kind of keep up with the Joneses and to keep up these appearances when it comes to these real issues? But I'm just curious from your perspective, because you have such a rich background of both experience in the sector, but also experiencing firsthand and accessing some of the services. Yeah, like what do you think it is that there's that gap that we can't do both? Be good and also do good.
So I'm a big fan of psychology, and I think it really informs my fundraising as well. And one of the things that I see a lot of nonprofits falling into is risk avoidance. So we are hardwired to avoid risk. So if something seems a little bit vague, we'll just reject it, even if it's the right choice for us. And because a lot of nonprofit leaders are running on empty, they don't have time to really like think through risk and strategy unless they're facing a deficit, for example, unless they're forced to do so. But day to day, they're too stuck in the weeds to kind of like move things forward in a way where it's like, if I'm facing resistance from the board, I can do X, Y, and Z. Here are my allies, and here are how I can kind of tap them in. Here's how I can like operationalize our values. They're not thinking that level of depth because they're exhausted. So I think really pushing for a community lens. So thank you for community centric fundraising for creating these principles, but really pushing for a community lens for partnership and collaboration within nonprofits would alleviate some of the pressure that our EDs are facing because they wouldn't have to do all the brain thinking themselves. They could learn from each other and have that pure collaboration to really bring their organizations to the next level, but also revisiting every time that you feel like risk averse or a fear, like where is that fear coming from and tracking that down to your core beliefs. And like if one of your core beliefs is this is an unsexy cause that no one wants to fund, or it's okay to keep doing this in this way because I'm going to be leaving in 2 years or something like that, really questioning if you're the right leader at this time to be leading this organization if one of the goals is to work towards social justice, collective liberation.
Wow, really well said. And I'm curious from your perspective, what can we do outside of, like I said, the galas and the raising awareness to actually get action done? And I really like what you said about coming with that community centric lens, because it is important, and this is a gap in, I'm a policy person by trade. This is a gap in policy making. You'll never understand the realities of someone from Newfoundland when you're sitting in Ottawa or only ever lived in Ottawa and Toronto. So, yeah, what from your perspective, how can we do better and more actionable change?
Yeah, so I'm not necessarily against galas. Like, I think they have a time and a place, but just for this specific organization that was serving people experiencing poverty, it felt like by design, it's not inclusive, right? So just rethinking what is inclusive by design. So not just building that kind of like psychological safety where people can chime in if they can do little changes, but I think that psychological agency where community members are actually involved in the creation of events or like their lived experience is informing your strategy and your storytelling and all those things. But I think that fundraising is one piece of the puzzle, right? That being said, fundraisers do have a lot of power. We have a lot of positional power because we're the closest to wealth and the closest to power. So internally, we're closest to the board. We're at the board table. We're chatting with them. We're informing their strategy decisions. And outside of the organization, we're the voice for the community and for all the staff people. So we are the ones that are building bridges. And I think that a really good way to do that is by having these conversations with donors openly and transparently around what is community centric fundraising, what is equity, why is what we're doing not enough to solve systemic issues, and why do we need to continue to focus on the piecemeal solutions and the long term shifts. So I think that's one really powerful thing that I've really enjoyed doing is having those conversations with major donors around white supremacy, wealth hoarding, capitalism, racism, and just bringing that education that will make them better allies, better advocates that I actually want to spend time with as a fundraiser. So not just kind of like washing my hands of this person's going to be a racist, capitalist, POS because they were born and raised rich, but giving them the tools to actually start dismantling some of the biases that they might already have within them.
Very well said. I think knowledge is power because I think a lot of what we're seeing now, especially with divisiveness politically on different issues, whatever it is, there's an ignorance. There's a lack of understanding of what are the realities of that person or that cause. And I want to ask you as well, like, how has the reception been when you bring these knowledge pieces to those donors? Like, are they resistant? Are they open to it? I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about that.
They're all so open to it. It's wild. Like it really blew my mind because I thought, oh, if my board doesn't get it, the donors are definitely not going to get it. But actually, the donors have been thinking about their wealth and their connection to power ever since the murder of George Floyd very intently. So this actually created something in them to start kind of learning and unlearning. So I found those conversations a lot easier. I think the only pushback that I had was one person saying like, well, my wealth wasn't created through extraction. But then talked about wealth hoarding. So it's not just about the creation and the extraction, but like now you have access to wealth that could be used out in the community. So yeah, most of the time I find them pretty open to having those conversations and thinking about it.
And how do you guide your clients? And correct me if I'm wrong, it's a bit twofold of your work. You help both the actual maybe philanthropists who want to donate to the causes, but you're also helping uplift some of organizations looking to fund. Is that correct? You're kind of a matchmaker between the donor and the organization?
I always consider fundraisers to be matchmakers, especially if you work in major gives. So, further together, what we do is we go into organizations that can't afford a senior fundraiser, or maybe they've worked with one that didn't work out, or maybe they were burned by a consultant. And what they're looking for is to increase their revenue in a values aligned way. But on top of that, I want to make sure that they do it in the least stressful way possible. So, we really focus on automation and donor retention and building systems so you never have to draft this grant application 7 times because you don't have an answer.
Yeah, it's funny how much work does get into the behind the scenes that not everybody sees. Like, I think maybe the public perception is the big check at the gala comes out and the organization's awarded it and everybody's happy and clapping. But there was someone behind the scenes who had to fill out that paperwork, had to organize people to get that money, pull a press conference together, whatever it is. So there is a lot of work behind the scenes that people don't see. So it's really remarkable that you do that. And again, bring it with that authentic lens of who do we want to support? How can you make sure that their values align? So, really interesting. And when you're building a fundraising campaign, I'm curious, like, where do you start? Is it with the story first or the data?
So I usually will collect many stories at once. And that will be based on different kinds of buckets that I think are best suited for the organization's positioning. So maybe one is health, maybe one is community, maybe one is mental health, right? So like really getting stories in these buckets. So then whenever I have an interesting stat, I know exactly which stories to go to build a campaign. But I definitely start with the stat because that's where I can see like costs have increased, or donors are giving less, or the need has increased, right? So it gives me a broader picture, and the story is just illustrative of that broader picture. Not 100% representative, but illustrative.
Very interesting. And I'm curious as well. So you made a point of seeing, okay, where the sectors maybe need needs, where's the data coming from? So one example that comes to mind, and we talked about it a little bit, is food banks, for instance. We're seeing a rise in the usage of food banks and food insecurity across Canada. Have you seen a correlation between affordability challenges and crisis versus the amount of people who are able to actually donate, whether it's financially or through material goods?
Absolutely. So I was working at a food bank organization like right after COVID, like 2021 to 2023, something like that. And what I saw there was kind of a multiple pronged issue. So, one, you have your smaller donors who are being pushed by the affordability crisis, who are less likely to give now because they have less disposable income. Not great. Then you have, all these like people who donate their time who are not able to come back and help with like stuffing hampers, X, Y, and Z, because there's a restriction on how many people can be in the space, or they feel unsafe, or they just got out of the habit of volunteering, so they're not coming back, right? Maybe they're working another job, who knows? Then you have your major donors who have a lot of their money invested, so it's not liquid. And when your stock portfolio is taking a hit, your capital gains tax is not reduced by giving your stock away at that time. So you really want to wait until it's like a better time for you to give it away so you can reduce your obligation to the state. So you have your major donors who are like a little more hesitant to give at that time, and your smaller donors who are not able to give, and volunteers who are also, for similar reasons, not able to be around as much. And then you have the cost of food increasing. So the cost of the organizations were also increasing, and our lower paid staff needed to get a raise, and more people are turning to us at the same time. So it is a very difficult situation to navigate.
Yeah, I appreciate that story of how it works and the impacts of it. And what's coming to mind is like the notorious trickle down economics, right? You gave me a little look when I said trickle down economics. Do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah. So I recently wrote a book chapter in this book, Against the People, How Ford Nation is Dismantling Ontario. And I did a big piece on food insecurity and how messed up the situation is and why so many people in Ontario are hungry. So part of it was we're expecting trickle down economics to work in a way that is favorable to people, but it just never is. And instead, we have triple up economics where the poorest people are the ones that are paying the highest price and making grocery oligarchs richer and richer.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. I talk about it a lot amongst my friends and family groups, the monopolies in Canada between our cell phone services, our food and grocery, and what we have access to. It's really unfortunate. And I think we do need more competition in the country to be able to offer that affordability and competitiveness to the consumer. I want to lean into the food insecurity piece. And I'm curious as well from your background. I think Canada and North American nations, we have insane amounts of food waste, which is a huge, huge issue. Is there any advocacy that you've been working with any of your clients or any organizations you're aware of how we can maybe tackle this issue? Because it blows my mind how we have a country that's both food insecure at high and alarming rates, but we're also at some of the highest food wastes, both on an individual level and at like a commercial level.
So, personally, I'm not a big fan of food waste going to food banks because I feel like, why are we treating people in this undignified way? Like, if it's not good enough to be sold, it's good enough to eat still. Okay, fine. It just doesn't feel like the most dignified thing because not everything that you get will be super, super fresh, right? And some food banks will have better access to these grocery stores. And it's usually like big, big food banks like Daily Bread or, CFCC who have this kind of connection and can maintain that kind of relationship with them. But not only that, like, there's a really weird relationship between grocers and nonprofits because, on one hand, grocers have these products which are still edible, but to get rid of them, they have to pay a per pound pickup fee to a garbage disposal person to come and pick them up. So instead of doing that, they give it to the nonprofit for free, right? They don't have to pay any kind of disposal fee. The nonprofit comes, picks it up, and then the nonprofit either gives them a gift in kind receipt. I'm not 100% how many nonprofits do that, but they're able to do that. But something else that comes to mind is we have something in Canada called like a Canadian Food Policy Committee. And there are a few different people on it. I think there's like 12 across the country. One of them being Lori Nickel, who is the CEO of Second Harvest. Now, Second Harvest, since the pandemic, 2019 to 2022, exponentially increased the size of their organization. So they are actually very focused on food waste and not landing in landfills, not on dignified food access. So that is a different take on that. And now the committee has actually put forward maybe we should champion and celebrate these food waste loss leaders, so celebrating Loblaws, celebrating Walmart for getting rid of their food waste, which again is a benefit to them in multiple ways. And the other thing that I forgot to mention is that sometimes brands will create these food flavors that no one actually wants. So an example that I give in the chapter is ranch flavored ice cream. And when they fail in the market, when they're rejected by the market, these new products then get donated to food banks, as if people experiencing poverty would want ranch flavored ice cream more than people who are not. So just the type of food is not very culturally appropriate. It might not be the freshest quality. We know that in most cases it's not. And if it is very fresh quality, it's usually an item that has been rejected by the market. And again, there's so much benefit to the grocers, while nonprofits feel like they must accept any item at whatever quality if they want to be considered the next time, which is why some organizations have done really well gathering this food because their focus is not dignified food access, while others have not had the connections or access to do so.
Yeah. And it brings to mind the unfortunate power dynamic, right? Of, like you said, I'm afraid to say no this time because maybe I won't get it the next time. And that dignified piece is so critical. And I'm going to play a little devil's advocate because I agree with you. But some people might say, well, people should just be grateful for what they get. What do you have to say to those kind of people who think, well, they're getting it for free, so why does it matter? Why do they have a say in it? Or why should they have a say in what they get?
I worked with an ED last year, and he shared this video of someone who had created like a shelter for people experiencing homelessness in the States. And in the shelter, he had a fountain. And people were asking him similarly, like, why do you need a fountain? It's just people who are homeless, they're happy to just be there. And for him, it wasn't a how can we do with less? It was how can we make people feel as human as possible and as welcomed as possible, regardless of their social economic status. And I feel similarly, like if I wouldn't do that for myself or for someone I care about, then why is it okay to expect someone to do it for themselves or their families? So that was a philosophy that the food bank I worked at, they had like, if I wouldn't feed it to myself or eat it myself, then we're not going to hand it out. So we did reject some lower quality donations.
Yeah, I appreciate that response. And I think that's the approach. Like, you're right. Like, it should be if I'm not going to eat this, why should somebody else? That's what I think gets missed when it comes to charity, nonprofits, is the lack of human element sometimes. I personally have not worked in the sector, but I'll go back to my policy piece. Like, there's a human element to this. We're not just numbers on a page. There's a piece of being dignified. With your organization further together, how do you keep fundraising authentic and dignified, especially when budgets are tight and stakes can be high?
I feel like there's a lot to unpack there because budgets being high or tight, like a lot of nonprofits make this mistake of leading with where they want to be in programs without considering where they are at in revenue. So organizations will set like, I want to grow year over year 40% and have no strategy to do so, no additional resources invested in fundraising, which is why a lot of fundraisers move from one organization to the next every 12 to 18 months, as we know. So the budgets being high shouldn't change your strategy because you should be looking at the highest return on investment opportunities, not trying to chase down whatever the board or your ED is doing with numbers picked out of thin air, right? So that would be one. By making sure that you're telling dignified stories is a really good, helpful one. Making sure that you're doing donor education and talking about the root causes of these effects that you're addressing, because usually you're addressing an effect. Doing stewardship for volunteers as well as for major donors, and also like spending time maybe once or twice a year doing that super personalized touch to get in touch with people in your community. So your donors are part of your community as well. Like give them that opportunity to feel like they matter, but not in a way where they're put in a pedestal. And I think if you do that for your staff and your volunteers as well, you're doing pretty well in leading ethically.
Yeah, well said. And Maria, I also want to go into we've talked on some of these themes, but your work blends public policy, strategic communications, coaching. How do you balance all those elements while staying mission driven and being able to succeed on that goal?
I think this is why like I lead so strongly with my values because people who are attracted to social justice and community centric and treating people human will want to fundraise in a way aligned with our values as well. So they find it easier to find me, which is great. And therefore, it's just working towards a common goal and eliminating kind of distractions and also barriers. So if there's organizations that come to me and they're focusing on too many things at once. They're throwing spaghetti at the wall. They're doing grants, events, planned giving, individual giving, peer to peer, corporates, and they're a little bit lost in the sauce. That is just a reduction. Like, let's focus on your highest return on investment opportunities. And we're going to focus on one to two of them for the next 12 months. Really build them up and systematize them so you don't have to worry about it again. And I think the other part would be to have those transparent conversations with my client as well, with the ED. So when something is not exactly brand aligned. It's maybe we don't want to have that kid tell their story in front of a whole crowd. Maybe we have their parent tell the story, right? So, like, shifting it slightly can be a huge, huge difference when it comes to community centric fundraising, but also like gentle pushback because we're all learning together. So sometimes they might push back on me, right? And that's a kind of relationship that I want to have with any people who are allies or advocates. Like, I want them to be able to call me in while I also call them in. And we keep learning, growing, and innovating together.
That's great. And I just want to ask, ED is executive director?
That's right.
Okay, great. And so I appreciate that you bring that strategic lens, right? Like optics matter, unfortunately, in the world we live in, and especially in that sector. And you made a point, well, maybe you don't want the child to share the story with the parent. How do you advise your clients to balance that? Because I can see maybe it's sometimes being a fine line of we don't want to be presented as like this token. But like, how do you balance that where it's still genuine to the story because you had shared experiences where you had felt that you were just being put forward for whatever reason or whatever motive the organization had. So, yeah, how do you yourself bring that experience and balance that for those organizations strategically?
So I have this one resource that I have as a free downloadable. We can link it in the show notes if you would like. But basically, it's 10 dignified storytelling questions. So it's a way to still get the stories that you need and get the consent that you need to fundraise successfully without harming that person. So instead of for myself, I was asked, what was it like living in a shelter? Obviously, it was bad. You know, like, how does that make me feel? It makes me feel kind of like an exhibit or something so odd. But the questions that I ask when I'm gathering stories is, can you tell me about how you heard about the organization? So they're welcome to share as much or as little as they would like, right? What do you think we give the community? So it's not like, what did you personally get? Start crying. We still get to cover the problem, the solution, the result, and the impact that that person experienced in their journey with your organization. So they were facing a problem. We provided the solution. What was the short term results and then the long term impact? And that's how you're still able to tell a story. But I do want to point out that World Vision, for example, and other international organizations in the past had these horrible ads with like kids with distended stomachs, covered in flies, starving, and they no longer fundraise in that way. Because while guilt does help in getting that first donation, donors will not stick around long term. And empowerment and hope actually works a lot better in that retention. So people who are empowered and who feel hope and who feel like what you do aligns with their vision of a better world, they will make a donation and they'll stick around. So fundraising in a way aligned with your values just benefits everyone. But people feel like, oh, maybe I don't fundraise as much, maybe I do, which I've proven that you fundraise a lot more.
Yeah, good points. And what also comes to mind is like that Sarah McLachlan song with the dogs, and it's like in the arms of the angel. Like pull at your heartstrings. I get it. And you made an interesting point there, and I'm curious because you're very active on social media. You said that a lot of like World Vision, other nonprofit organizations have shifted the way that they interact with people to get those donations for a longer term benefit. What role has social media changed of pulling at those heartstrings and getting people to be donors, whether it's they want to because they feel bad or maybe because there's actually a cause they're passionate about? I'm curious, how have you seen the landscape change with the social media element?
I feel like a lot of nonprofits do social media quite poorly. So I feel like maybe it would be better to spend some time focusing on what they could be doing better. Because simply right now, a lot of nonprofits, what they do is they post like internal updates externally, like we hired this person, we're closed on Friday, which is not helpful. That's not why people donate to you. So first would be like getting clear on your ideal audience. Who are the type of people who care about your work? Is it because they care about mentorship? Is it because they experienced something similar or their family member did? Like, why do they care? Then find out where on social media these people hang out because online is your 24/7 fundraiser, right? So, are they on Reddit? Are they on LinkedIn? Are they on Facebook? Are they on Pinterest? Don't pick all these platforms at once. Be smart about where your people are hanging out. For me, that's on LinkedIn. That's why I'm very active on LinkedIn because executive directors are in their inbox. So I could do cold email or they're on LinkedIn, which to me, LinkedIn is just way better because I can warm them up and actually engage with their content and have them engage with mine in a way that doesn't feel like they're being pitched something. So really thinking strategically who your audiences are, where you can find them, and then if you're looking to solicit donations from them, I feel like that's also kind of a misstep unless you're a large organization with a large social media marketing budget and know what you're doing with ads. But ideally, I encourage organizations to, instead of thinking it as a solicitation opportunity, to think about it as a list building opportunity because it's much, much easier to collect 200 emails than it is to get a $10 a month donation from strangers, right? So, really thinking through the purpose of social media as part of a funnel towards your donation page, towards your email subscription page, rather than the end point of the funnel that is just a transaction.
Yeah, well said, Maria. So please, on that note, if you like what Maria said, make sure you're reaching out to her for some of the strategy around the communications space because it is a game. It's picking up these patterns, like you said, understanding where your demographic is. And the currency now is data. It's getting someone's email and making sure you're always in their inbox to remind them of whatever your cause is. And you mentioned you're very active on LinkedIn, but you're also a podcaster. I'm curious, like, how have you been able to bring and merge your business and passion into the podcasting world? And what has that been like for you, that journey?
So it's been a little bit interesting because as a business owner, I want the podcast to generate some kind of return on investment. And so far, it's been a loss leader because I'm, spending time on it. I'm paying someone to edit it. I'm paying for platforms that I wouldn't use otherwise, right? Like softwares and stuff. And then also the like sunk cost of time that it could be using for something else, right? But that being said, as a fundraiser, I'm having a great time with the podcast because I get to talk to people and talk about topics that I'm very, very knowledgeable about that many of the people in my life don't want to hear about, right? So, let's talk about good practices for tax receipting. It's not going to be an exciting topic for my friends, but it might be a really exciting topic to have some guests come on and talk about here's what we did, here's what worked, what didn't work. But I've been able to have really amazing conversations. So, one of them was about a Chicago Eco House. They started a social enterprise that basically they plant flowers in abandoned lots, and they've been able to generate $2 million of that or a year in B2B and B2C sales. So just thinking how nonprofits are doing things differently and chatting about innovation has been so interesting. And that's something that I really love about the podcast. But I'm now kind of visiting how can the podcast be part of my funnel, especially on YouTube, having those episodes on YouTube, and how can they then lead to deeper knowledge of my work?
Well said. And on that note, how has that changed? You mentioned some pieces about leadership and innovation, but how has the storytelling also impacted you when it comes to bringing in people about these issues and making sure that these nonprofit topics feel relatable?
So I always try to break it down in the same way that I would an appeal, problem, solution, result, and impact, and make it very relatable to that person because no matter what the person I'm interviewing says, other people have experienced that the sector has very similar problems one organization to the next, right? So it's just been really interesting. But usually during my pre-screening calls, I'll ask them what's one topic that you think needs to be heard right now? I talk to executives in the States and in Canada, there is half and half the audience. So what's one topic that you think that they need to be thinking about urgently? And let's cover that.
And on that note, since you work across border, what have you seen, if you've seen any patterns between what are US organizations really calling on the government for now versus Canada? Have you seen differences or overlap?
Well, in the States, they're a lot more under attack right now, nonprofit organizations. So you have bills that are kind of trying to declare them terrorist organizations or trying to revoke charitable status. Or, there's also a lot of legal cases in the States around suing organizations that are equity based. So there was one where this organization was providing micro loans or micro bursaries to Black women business owners. And they got sued by some white guy, taken all the way to the Supreme Court about they were being racist against him, which we all know is ridiculous. But yeah, so I think in the States are facing a lot more different challenges on top of the day-to-day nonprofit challenges. But I've talked to some people on the podcast, and one person during the pre-screen call, everything was fine, but during the actual recording, she had to already let go of 90% of her staff because of cuts to USAID. So it's kind of a very rapidly changing landscape in the States. In Canada, we still have a lot of things going well, which is great. But similarly, in both countries, there's still a hesitancy to advocate. And they understand that with the charitable registration on the line. But at a time where democracy is being dismantled and you have a genocide and you have a lot of horrible things going on, including attacks on immigrants and trans people and women's reproductive rights, I think it's a really important time to speak out and speak out in a way that is holistic.
Yeah, I'm honestly speechless. I just started The Handmaid's Tale, and funny enough, I think today's also the season finale. But the eeriness of the reality between that dystopia and what we're seeing slowly unfold, especially in the US, is I'm just speechless every night I finish that episode. So, yes, the US is the reality that we're all watching unfold before our eyes. And I take your points around the challenges I can't imagine those organizations are experiencing. One I was looking at right now with reproductive rights on women, you know, the vote down from the Senate recently on Medicaid and who's being impacted by that. And realistically, they're putting it under this guise that it's able-bodied men at home who aren't working or all these alien refugees that are taking your Medicaid. Meanwhile, it's really just taking away basic health care for basic people in precarious socioeconomic situations. We know that's going on in the US, but what have you seen as maybe some of the most pressing issues in Canada?
I feel like in both Canada and the States, there's just a lack of knowledge of how the nonprofit sector operates. So that has been one issue on top of all the regular nonprofit issues. But something else that I've seen is xenophobia creeping in a little bit more publicly into what nonprofits are doing. So, for example, there was this food bank, I can't remember which one exactly, but you can definitely Google it because it was a Globe and Mail article or something. But basically, what it was they had started turning away international students. Like you're starting to kind of assess who is a worthy recipient of aid and who isn't. And that to me is very, very concerning. And then especially I looked at their website like 6 months later to be like, where are they now? And they're active on X. So there's like a lot of organizations that may not have done something like that before, but may feel emboldened by the actions that are happening in the States.
Mm, interesting. So it's creeping in. And again, to be devil's advocate, I don't disagree with you, but I think when you talk to the average Joe, they're like, well, again, the argument, I don't necessarily agree with it, but their argument is, well, they came here, they should have known what to expect. They should have known the cost burden of coming to a country. And it's interesting that we say this too. We're seeing this rise of xenophobia. It's coming from immigrants, interestingly, as well, where there's a lot of immigrants saying, we don't want more immigration in Canada. I'm not expecting you to have the answer, but I'm just curious, like, how do we combat these narratives when it's so prevalent, when it's immigrants? We're all immigrants to Canada, let's be real, but more recent or newer immigrants who are also sharing these rhetorics or whatever against other newcomers. I'm curious, like, just from a dialogue perspective, what are your thoughts on that and how can we talk about it?
I think the immigrant thing has actually also stuck out to me, and I've thought about it in relation to the Venezuelan immigrants that voted for Trump. Because, like, I understand why someone would do that. Like, it's just the proximity to safety, the proximity to whiteness, the proximity to power, right? Like, it's just a way of maybe keeping yourself safe while projecting onto the other. So I am a legal immigrant. That's an illegal one. So projecting onto the other to maintain your own sense of safety, which is obviously not correct. And I would say that the regular Joe Schmo is also projecting onto the other because of a lack of safety in their own life. So, one of the things that I've come to realize more and more is that community is the only way through. So, it's not just about the policy wins, but it's also about that broader education for the community to see their role in it and to understand that there's no war but the class war. Even racism, which is so prevalent, like, is sheltered by wealth. Like Oprah or whoever has a very different lived experience. So, really talking about the equal distribution of resources is the best way forward, in my opinion, versus trying to fight over scraps.
As we're just wrapping up here, you've led your teams through very big transitions as well, unionization, rebrands, pandemic. What's your approach to leadership in tough transitions?
Oh man, pandemic was rough, but I think rougher was the unionization process because there was so much distrust of management. And of course, here I am, the director of fundraising, which some program staff will already naturally distrust because they feel like you're here to exploit my community. So I'm having to build a trust on multiple fronts. And a way that I do that personally is really trying to build that psychological safety by being vulnerable myself. So I don't have all the answers. Actually, I'm just a team member just like you. My role is to make decisions quickly, but you have a role too. So we are working in partnership here. So being vulnerable, but I don't have all the answers is one part. Making sure that we're doing an iterative process where everybody gets to actually say their opinion and not only say your opinion, but actually inform the strategy. So one thing that we did there was we had hired these plan giving experts to do webinars for our donors to talk about how they could reduce their estate obligations to the state, which of course is not CCF aligned. So we did one and we're like, oh, this is really cramping our style. And it was my communications officer, who's not a fundraiser, who was like, I don't love this. Like, let's get rid of it. And then the whole team was like, yeah, let's get rid of it. And then I had to take that to the board of like, yeah, I know that we paid. We're going to try to get a refund. So is that kind of opportunity for everyone to share their best ideas and to feel like they can contribute to the actual team environment, agency, their work life because, we spend so much time at work, and to feel like if they make a mistake, they're not going to be punished. But if you go around like punishing every single person for any mistake, like you're just going to have a team that feels like they're walking on eggshells, like they can't come to you with a problem, or like their job might be unsafe if they don't do everything at a perfectionist level. One other thing that I like to do is setting up mini meetings, like 15 minutes to just talk about our life. Like, what movie are you watching? What are you doing? So there's like an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit more. And then also an informal space to talk. So whether that's like a Slack group where you're just sending memes to each other throughout the day of, oh my God, here we go again, or a WhatsApp group also I've used, like that can help really build that camaraderie and get that quicker communication back and forward.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm so glad that you've been able to build your brand of yourself and be successful at doing it and working on all these really important issues. And one of my last questions here, like, how do you define success in your work? Because it's not just metrics, but there's meaning to it. So, yeah, how do you define success at Further Together?
I think for me, it's about operationalizing our values as much as possible. I think that's what success means to me. So, if social justice is one of my values, how are we doing that? If excellence is one of my values, how are we doing that? So, for example, we are going to be piloting a 4-day work week over the summer, right? And hopefully we can do that 100%. But trying it out, leading with my values when it comes to online stuff. So I did a speaking session of how to talk to donors about white supremacy, capitalism, and racism, providing free resources. So I have a whole bunch of downloadables and the podcast, and even make time to chat with people here and there about the problems that they're facing and the problems that they're seeing in community, but just really trying to go together as much as possible. There's this saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's where the name Further Together comes from, right? Like we are going together, we're innovating together, and we have a shared set of values, me and the client, that we want to operationalize not only in our independent organizations, but in the sector and in the world as a whole. Like, let's focus on advocacy, let's focus on systemic solutions. And I think the way that we talk about our work, the way that we talk about the organizations that we work with, like, we don't put them on a pedestal. We talk about their impacts in a way that is very effective, but it's not overblown or underblown. I think all of that is very important to come together to define success.
That was beautifully said. What a way to end it, Maria. That was Maria Rio. She's the founder of Further Together. And Maria, any other closing thoughts you want to share with our listeners?
I think one of my last things is take care of yourself. Like you never understand how much toll stress has on your body, on your physical and mental health. So really keep track of how many hours you're sleeping, how many glasses of water are you having, how many walks have you been able to take today. Those things will actually really add up to make everything a little bit more bearable, because now is not the time that we need you burnt out. Now we need you 100% in. So make sure that you're taking care of yourself, putting your air mask on before you're helping others is so important.
Well, that was Maria Rio. She's the founder of Further Together. Make sure to reach out for any executive coaching, fundraising, strategy, you name it. Maria's got it. And we'll be sure to include all of her links in the show notes. So thanks so much for tuning into Hashtag Fempire. And a big thank you to Maria for sharing her knowledge and insights on the sector. It's a really great conversation. Be sure to tune in next week for my next special guest. We'll catch you there.